Eternal God, we gathered this evening to give thanks to your son, John Qwelane, and to give thanks to you for the service that he rendered to your people. We ask you to bless this congregation, this service. Bless those who are bereaved and be a comforter to them. We ask all of this through the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you, one God, world without end. Amen. Amen. Friends, the letter of St. Paul to Romans chapter 8, verses 31 to 39. It reads as follows. What then shall we say to this? If God is for us, who is against us? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Who shall separate us from that wonderful love that he shared with us? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? No, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am certain that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, no powers, no height, no depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ our Lord. Friends, these are ancient words of St. Paul we use tonight to say goodbye to JQ, to wish him well as he joins eternity. Many love your articulation of issues. They also loved your intellect, your wisdom, your brain. We will all miss these great human attributes. I do not have a crystal ball to help me fathom how Joe Qwelane may be feeling about your death. As far as my recollection go, you, Joe, and John were what I could describe as birds of the same feather. As you pursued the craft you both loved with a passion. You both found great joy to dabble with words, tinker with words to give them profound meaning for the edification of your readers. Sadly, tonight, you, JQ, are the subject of this memorial service, which we do in your honor, and we do so with heavy hearts. So sorry, Joe, about your beloved JQ, your body. He's going back to Mother Earth to be part of eternity. We give thanks to God for your life. It is the life we all or to be proud. I now turn to Umama Qwelane, unkosikazi of the big man, JQ. I also turn to JQ's beautiful children, Uphumla noSobube. To you, my friends, may the words of St. Paul, his letters to the Romans, find a home in your hearts at this difficult period of your bereavement. They are ancient words spoken by a man long dead, a man of foreign origin, yet the import of their meaning remains relevant. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things to come, no powers, no height, no depth, nor anything else in creation will separate us from the love of God. Not even death, Phumla, not even JQ's death. We are people of hope. Healing will come to us, and we wait for that healing. It is that love that has tonight brought us together to be in solidarity with the Qwelanes in their moment of pain and sorrow. I end my eulogy with these words. JQ, our friends, never pretended to be a saint, but he never stopped to chase after goodness. He never stopped chasing after righteousness and justice. As an adherent of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, he desired peace and justice in his land and the return of land to the African people. Could it be that JQ in death may be hearing the voice of his mentor, Sobukwe, when he said, and I quote, "Here is a tree rooted in African soil, nourished with waters from the rivers of Africa. Come sit under its shade and become with us the leaves of the same branch and the branches of the same tree. So go well, broer. Your fearful trip wrecked by ill health is over. The ship has now weathered every storm." Menza phumle ngonaphakade Nkosi uJohn Qwelane, umkhanyiselo ngokhanyiso olungacimiyo. Amen.
Maud and I will be doing the program directing. We want to thank the committee for providing this opportunity to have this event. I think I will allow Maud to do some remarks on her part, and then we will have my remarks, and then we go ahead with the program.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, and thank the committee for arranging this get-together. We gathered here to celebrate an important man, a celebrated journalist. I personally knew John Qwelane when we were both cub reporters at the Star. We were in our 20s then. I must say, at the time, he was the best in his breed. And over 40 years, I had the opportunity of knowing all the shades of John. Brilliant, arrogant, confident in himself, stubborn, prepared to stand his ground. And I must say that as he got older, it got worse and worse. But it was always John, and we're celebrating him today.
Thank you. My remarks are not as long as well, they are quite short. JQ was an irreplaceable character in the media world. His impact was felt wherever he went. He was kind of a journalist that made readers look up to another day of a story. One reader whom John had really got hot under the collar once wrote a letter to the Star to say, "It is time, John, you took a holiday to a vale of 1,000 hills and spent 1 year at each hill." But John was not a quitter. And as we know, John represented our cause in various international forums. These included the Institute of Press, as well as the UN and the, what do you call this other one? And the International Federation of Journalists. On his passing, we all understand with the COVID regulations, we could not have celebrated John in the manner we could. And this webinar gives us an opportunity to do so in the best possible way we could. So we hope we will share our experiences. We welcome everybody who's been able to log in as we celebrate the unforgettable John that we loved, all of us.
We are going to look at all the facets of John. JQ as a journalist in the print and broadcasting media, JQ as a trade unionist, JQ as an activist and a diplomat, JQ's experiences in Alcoholics Anonymous, and of course, John Qwelane as a family man. We'll go straight to our panelists who are going to talk about John briefly, and then we are going to keep it interactive. The panelists will present briefly, and we will ask a few questions, and anyone who wants to ask a question can do so in the chat group, and we will look at the questions after. Now, the first person on the list is Tony Deegan. Tony Deegan was our boss on the Africa edition of the Star, and I haven't seen him for years. Trust John to get us together today. So over to you, Tony.
Well, thank you very much. You are certainly bringing back the past, because I, in fact, lost touch with you and John and many others. I think it must have been about 35 or so years ago. So I'm going far back into the past, and you've pulled up the ghosts of the past. But you know, there are three things I have to say about John. The first, from the very first interaction with him, his skill with words and with concepts was very clear and was ahead of most people. And I think that was the biggest thing that was recognized in him, that yes, you used the word, I'd say he was opinionated. He was certainly opinionated, and that's what led to a number of clashes, but he never, as you said, stood back from his opinions. But what was recognized is his ability to actually voice them, articulate them in the best possible way. And I think that was his talent, was without question. His ability with words, concepts was there. And I remember that very clearly, even though it's a long time ago. And I don't think I've seen John actually since then. But the other thing I have to say is that at the time I knew him, John was battling with his own inner demons. And I'm talking about alcohol. And I respect hugely that the battle that he had and what he did with it, and how he was able to come to terms and beat it. And that is a sign of someone of quality and of deep, human dimension. And that's why one can overlook a lot in someone who has that capacity to fight and overcome. And fight was something that John was always prepared to do. Fight for what he believed and fight for something that was worthwhile. And that's why I respect John. And that's why I'm very pleased, even after such a long time, because I left the Star in 1984. And after such a long time, to recall him and to say with great respect that I acknowledge him and respect him for the man he was. Disagree or agree with him, that's not the point. Those are details. The rest is what is in the person. And he certainly had deep inequalities. So, Maud, thank you. I'm delighted to recall my time with John and to be here. And I appreciate the invitation very much, because it's such a long time. One could have said, yeah, I'm part of the distant past. So much appreciated, Joe and Maud, for inviting me. And I'll be happy to hear also what others, how they recall John. Thank you, Maud.
Can I ask you a quick question before you go away?
No, I'm here. I'm not going. Yeah.
You must have recognized John's ability right from the beginning.
Yes.
Because you were
Yes.
very tolerant of him. I'll remind you of an incident or incidences that you once or twice you would send me off to Soweto to go and look for him on a Monday morning when he didn't pitch. and I'd go with the driver there, which means, did you know then that he was that gifted?
Oh, yes. No, one was aware. And here I have to say, you know, that the late Harvey Tyson, who was then our editor, he was one that also had huge tolerance of where John was and what he was battling with. And I think that Tyson came in for some criticism because some people felt he was giving more latitude to John than he might have given to a few others who had also some similar problems. But I think that goes back to the fact that John's talent was recognized and the feeling that if he could fight his own demons, that talent would have a chance to come out fully, as opposed to being limited by those demons that he was battling with. So certainly, yes. But it was because one recognized the potential that was always there. And thank goodness it was never balanced against saying, well, sorry, unless you sort yourself out, goodbye. I don't think that was ever it wasn't on the agenda. It was a case of how can one get through to a point where this potential can really flower. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
And what was your memorable, something that comes to mind that is unforgettable about John?
I guess his opinionatedness.
Yeah.
He had opinions on most things. And those opinions were sometimes prickly. I remember, you know, the media was a very much, call it an establishment newspaper.
At the time.
John wasn't an establishment person. You know, and while one, on theory, one could always say, yes, you know, opinions are free and we open to all opinions. We all know that every medium has its own, let's call it framework, if not bias, as to what is almost not so much allowable, but what is an acceptable opinion. And John's opinions probably weren't always acceptable, quote unquote, in terms of the establishment. So certainly his opinions, but again, that's why I do credit Harvey Tyson as editor for recognizing that agree or disagree, one doesn't hopefully dispose of a person of potential who can articulate these things so well. Otherwise, we're in a dire state if we simply, you know, close those opinions down, which unfortunately has happened too often at times in our history. So, yeah, John was that person. Opinions, yes, that's what I remember of John, certainly,
Sure.
is the opinionatedness, which one would have to, you know, agree or disagree with. But it was there, and that was part of what John was. As Maud said, arrogant, yes. I'd say opinionated, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Good evening and welcome to the studio, Mr. Mandela.
Good evening, John.
We've just heard on the news that a recommendation by the Joint Working Committee of the IEC, the KwaZulu government and the South African government is that in the current political climate, elections cannot be held in KwaZulu. Your comment on that, please.
I have grave reservations about that statement. The state of emergency has been declared expressly for the purpose of ensuring that there are free and fair elections in Natal.
Now, going to this meeting on Friday with Chief Buthelezi, President de Klerk, and King Zwelithini, which is precisely about the crisis, the elections crisis in Natal. What are you taking to that meeting?
Well, it would not be fair for me to discuss with the mass media what I intend conveying to the King. Beyond that, I would request you not to press me, because the actual contents of my proposals have to be made to the King first before I can then brief the mass media.
You are listening to the president of the ANC, Mr. Nelson Mandela. After the carnage in Johannesburg last week, that was last week, Monday, police with a warrant empowering them to search your headquarters failed to fulfill their mission. Did you personally intervene and block the search of your premises for weapons allegedly used in the fatal shooting of 8 people?
There is some misunderstanding on this question, which of course is quite genuine.
That's Nelson Mandela, leader of the ANC, taking your calls on 8830-702. Straight to the lines we go. Bruma Lake, Roger, good evening.
Good evening. The lack of discipline in our country at the moment and the apparent failure of the National Peacekeeping Force leads us to worry about a lack of control, on a greater scale than is happening at the moment. I'd just like to know Mr. Mandela's views on this issue.
Thank you.
Finger pointing must eventually lead to mudslinging. It will aggravate tensions and will not help us at all in reaching amicable solutions. So it is very important that leaders must now address their own followers and make sure that they avoid any action or course of conduct which may lead to the worsening of the crisis and the death of innocent people.
Nelson Mandela talking to you probably in his last live radio broadcast as Ordinary Joe Soap Mandela. Sue in Glen Vista, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Mandela. One of the things the ANC is promising the nation is free and equal education for all. As a mother of 2 school-going children, would my children also qualify for free education?
Well, I don't know why you should raise this question. It may well be that perhaps you are not an African, colored, or Indian. I assume that is why you are raising this question. But as far as we are concerned, we insist on free education for the first 10 years for all South Africans, irrespective of your color. And therefore, your children, if you are a South African, and even if you are a foreigner staying in this country, there will be free and compulsory education for the first 10 years for everybody.
Erling in Bedford View, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Don, and very, very sincere thank you to Mr. Mandela for making himself available to the people like this. Mr. Mandela, when the ANC comes to power, as undoubtedly they're going to do, what, sir, are you going to do about the IFP and their marching with weapons? Marches are accepted in any democratic country, and that's fine, but what are you going to do about disarming the IFP and the antagonistic AWB in particular?
Thank you very much for the question, Erling.
we will do what we intend doing on Friday when we meet the King and Chief Buthelezi. We attach importance to dialogue, to solving problems through negotiations. It is an art which requires a great deal of vision, strength of character on the part of leaders, and a vision. We have made a tremendous progress by sticking to this strategy of addressing problems. That is what we are doing now. That is what we will continue doing after the 27th of April. Dialogue is going to be one of our main strategies in resolving problems. But of course, in this particular case now in Natal, we have combined both the political as well as the security initiative, because we have been talking to one another since I came out of prison. And violence is still escalating and the innocent people continue to die. And the state of emergency has been introduced solely for the purpose of ensuring that the people are protected and that there are free and fair elections. Otherwise, our own methods of addressing problems is through dialogue.
But how do you hope to conduct dialogue, for example, with the AWB? Up to now, Eugene Terblanche has point-blank refused to have meetings with you or with the ANC.
Well, you must remember that the National Party once took precisely the same position as the AWB today. But we have been able to persuade them to come on board.
If you were there, Kantel, would you remember how tense the moment was after the confrontation in Shell House? And if you recall this interview and how Mandela handled the situation and his interaction with journalist John in particular, how would you share the manner in which carefully Mandela navigated the nation? Kantel?
Yeah, I think I was chuckling just now when I was hearing Madiba's words, because they are so opposite to our times, which is that it will finger pointing will inevitably lead to mudslinging. But against the backdrop of that, I think when we consider everything that was going on at the time, John, considering that he had come from a print background, had managed to carve out a space on 702 that really was unique. To this day, we have people talking about how Jonathan was able to negotiate those times. And his voice at that level was actually sorely missed in the context of the way in which radio is conducted today. The finger pointing and the mudslinging is now the shall we say the modus operandus of the hosts these days, rather than the balanced voice of reason that Jonathan was back then. I've yet to see someone who was able to maintain, particularly since we knew how strong his views were on so many things, but he was able to separate himself from what was happening around him and still manage to be that voice of reason. I was remarkably surprised at the time, because I would say this is not the Jonathan that I know, because he has strong opinions on everything. I will pause there.
Clearly, John was also trusted with the confidences. Anything that Mandela may have shared with him in confidence, that confidence was never betrayed. And that he picked him up even later in life when he decided to go down the aisle. It shows that he had earned Madiba's trust. Any comment? if we're okay, we will move to someone who worked with John closely. And for a number of years, he was there, 10 years at 702. Today, he may be associated more with water and the department that deals with water in this country, but we remember him most as producer to John's show, Sputnik Ratau. Are you there?
Yes, I am here, Opa, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I must say I am honored to be part of today's event, and thank you very much, Brajo, for asking me. And I must say it is an honor. Yes, I did work with John at 702 when he came on. I was producing Talk at 9, so we became part of a team together with Thabo Modisane, who was always being talked about as being behind the big table there in the studio. But I must say that it was interesting that when John came in, it was, I think, also a harsh reality to the normal listeners of 702 at the time. They would not have thought that you would have a darky to come and drive the night show and 9 to midnight. And especially the one that included one part of the show that he liked a lot, the open lines, where people could be able to just say anything and everything that they wanted to talk about. And I must say that I do agree with Mr. Deegan about him being opinionated and a very strong person when he has taken a stand on anything, because all of the people that were able to come onto the air in that period would have known that they have really interacted with someone who, one, was always knowledgeable. He read a lot. He made it a point that he knew what he was talking about. And therefore, it would be very tough to actually run rings around him. And I know with even, the rabbis are Jewish, that you wouldn't have expected somebody else to actually talk with such authority on. One of the things that he always wanted was that when you come onto the show, you must always stick to your principles. I think he really did not take kindly to people who flip-flop or who come with stories like he said, she says, and what have you, and you don't have the background, and therefore you cannot stand, scrutiny in those on those issues. So those are some of the things that we used to really work through together with Thabo Modisane and Ian Crew being the newsreader for the best part of that time. But if I may want to highlight maybe one or two programs that really, really were the highlights of our time at 702 before I joined government, as you are correctly saying, Mr. Ngwenya. We actually hosted the old man, Credo Motwa, I think on no less than 2 occasions. And it was a fascinating discussion each time because they would talk about things historical, philosophical, be it African history or world history or anything that would have impacted on our lives even at the time. And one of the things that you would always find very interesting was that the old man would never come into the studio with a script from where to read. Everything that he spoke to would be coming from his memory, from his knowledge, from the issues that he had interacted with over a long period of time. And I must say it was a very long period of time. The second program that really, I think that they shot even the listenership through the stratosphere was when we hosted the late Mamwini Madikizela Mandela, may her soul rest in peace. But it was not just her. She was in the company of the Reverend Louis Farrakhan. And you can all immediately think about what happened when people got to know that we are hosting those two people in the studio at 702 with the kind of listenership that we had. It was one of the most fascinating times that we had. I even had a call from one of the bosses at the time, Vasily Vas, who wanted to know why we didn't tell them that we would be hosting these two people. But we couldn't do that because of an agreement that John had with Mamwini, that he wouldn't announce they are coming to the studio until they are in the studio. And John always knew that if he were to have crossed that line, Mamwini could have simply pulled the rug and we wouldn't have had that. But at the end of the day, John really grew into that program. People started identifying Talk at 9 with John Qwelane. And I see that we have one of our most ardent listeners of the time and who always had a go at John, and John would obviously return that. And he even took the time to go and visit this man at his farm in the Free State. I mean, Eddie von Maltitz, because he also owns a mountain, I hear. But I think I will not take the shine out of him. But Sismod and Brao, let me leave it there for now. And I think we can interact on any other thing around the time that we had with John. But John always taught you, you've got to read, you've got to be able to stand your ground, and you must always be confident of what you're doing. One of the things that was always interesting to me, and this is a side issue, was that he made it a point that in his car, he had a whole carton of Mills. You know that he always smoked Mills cigarette, and he would make sure that he doesn't run short because there would be a carton in the boot. And I found that to be very interesting. Who does that? Anyway, I don't even know any other person who has done that up to now. Thank you very much.
Evening and welcome. My name is John Qwelane. We are in the studio with the State President, Mr. F.W. de Klerk. I won't even read a resume of his impeccable qualifications because if you are in South Africa and you don't know him honestly, you are perhaps living in a wrong place altogether. Thank you very much again, Mr. de Klerk, for being with us tonight.
Thank you and good evening. It's good to be here.
What happened to induce Chief Buthelezi to come aboard the electoral process?
It is difficult to speak for him. He took the decision. Firstly, I think what happened is that we didn't give up. I didn't give up. I called him. Other people didn't give up. Professor Ukumu spoke to him. Many people in our country were deeply concerned, and I think we must assume that there was a lot of pressure on him.
But the point, Mr. President, is that substantially nothing has changed between yesterday and Skukuza. One could even argue that the offer at Skukuza was a lot better than what he ultimately settled for yesterday. So was he induced, say, by a very senior post in the government of April 28 or not?
No, not at all. I made no offers. I offered no inducement from my side, and I'm not aware of any other offers or inducements. You must remember, I've learned that lesson, and history learns us that lesson about negotiation. Sometimes the longer you wait, the less you get. If we look to the old Rhodesia, to Zimbabwe, the truth of that is apparent.
That's Mr. F.W. de Klerk, State President of South Africa, taking your calls on 883-0702. Straight to the lines we go. Richard in Vosloorus. Good evening and welcome.
Evening, John Qwelane.
Yes, sir.
Evening, State President. I would like to pose this question. Should the National Party win the election, I want to know what action will they be taking to members within their ranks who doesn't want to accept changes and are practicing discrimination?
Well, I would firstly like to say we don't have any such members anymore. They left the National Party when the Conservative Party was formed. Surely there are individuals, maybe. We abolished the discriminatory laws on our statute book. We took the initiative to free the people of South Africa. And therefore, the National Party has already freed itself of racism.
Thank you, Richard. Let's go to Constantia, to Anek.
Mr. President, I would like to know, why was Mr. Mandela regarded above the law when the police was not allowed to search the Shell House after the massacre? Why didn't the MP, which is still the government, do something about that?
Well, thank you very much for that question. It gives me the opportunity to put a misconception right. There was, at a certain stage, a story that I intervened I issued a press statement then, and I want to repeat it tonight. I was in no way involved in the decision of the police not to execute the warrant, the search warrant. Mr. Mandela approached them directly, and he undertook to make available the weapons for ballistic tests, and it was a police decision, and the government, politicians should not interfere in ordinary security decisions.
Sputnik, I just want to go back to you before we jump to another panelist. Of interest to me, there are two things. One, with Mandela, Winnie Mandela, and Farrakhan, there was so much interest in the program to a point where you were asked why there was no prior warning. But with the de Klerk, it didn't seem to be there was as much interest for such a request to have been made. In your recall, in comparing the two incidents, how would you say the radio station responded? Two, what I also want to know is, having worked with John, I'm interested to know if he ever discussed with you the meaning behind the name Dubula, because it is other name that we never got to use. But you know that he shot from the hip with a good aim.
Yes, very interesting. The second one, he actually steered clear of it. He wouldn't discuss it very much. And I think we also steered clear of it. But I wouldn't have been surprised, understanding that he was also very strongly bought, you know, and so the Dubula would come very easy to him. On the other question that you asked, I think at the time we had the opportunity to actually interact with a lot of people who were high on the, or rather who were very politically high riders, for a lack of a better word. And therefore it was not surprising for us to be interviewing anybody from the parties. And that had gone through the normal programming processes where we would go and share information with our colleagues as well to say this is what is going to happen. Because part of what happens in the background is that when we share information about what we are going to do, then some of the activities we are going to be involved in get highlighted in the programs that come before you guys come in, so that already by the time you start your program, there is a huge amount of interest in what you are going to be discussing. But in the case of hosting Mamwini and Reverend Farrakhan, it was a very tight rope that we had to walk. Understanding that at the time, Mamwini was still almost regarded as a firebrand in the broader society. And a lot of people would have loved to just take aim at her from any other point. But on the issue of also having Reverend Farrakhan in there, who is openly known worldwide to be a very strong Muslim leader, who has very strong opinions about the state of Israel and the happenings in Lebanon and all of that, it wouldn't have been the best for us to do prior warning, because that would have meant that we would have easily shot ourselves in the foot and maybe shot from the hip as well for our program, because there are possibilities that it could have either been canned, or it could have been that we could have brought much more unhappy interest onto the station prior to this to the program happening. And remember that we have to be realistic, that the listenership at the time for a station like Radio 702 was primarily white, and primarily, you know, it had a certain listenership that was very clear that it wouldn't stand some of the issues that we were dealing with. I mean, a lot of people were not even happy that a person like John Qwelane is actually running the 9 to midnight show. If they would have been, if it were to have been upon them, they would have simply said to the station, don't bring that man onto the station, simply because of who he was, his opinions, and everything that he stood for. Thank you.
John, what about the Sowetan this morning? What is their main story?
Sowetan says there is war in Davidson. That's the main story, and there's a very chilling picture of a man on the front page with a balaclava cap hiding half his face, and he's having an AK-47. The prevalence of AK-47s, I suppose, is also something that's going to come under the spotlight in view of the arms cache that was uncovered in Foslura's hostel yesterday, 12 AK-47s. Quite a lot of magazines and rounds of ammunition confiscated. But also, I think, Dave, the violence in the East Rand, without sounding a prophet of doom, is going to be the story for most of the week. Because there's certainly no way that I see this violence abating.
Clearly a guy who had politics, whose politics were known, but interestingly, in practicing his journalism, the politics did not come into his journalism. Actually, some of the people who were not aware of his politics would scarcely have associated him with the PAC. How did you encounter John?
I was saying, and this is around 85, and being a student, I was coming from a generation of reading everything that one came across. Newspapers, magazines, we read everything. But we were particularly interested in politics because we were young activists in the township. And we were also cognizant of the fact that Vista was the highest learning institution in Soweto, the biggest township, of course. Now, one of the people that I read a lot, John Qwelane, Joe Qwelane in the Sowetan agri-class thing. We even remember the columns that they wrote. When I first got to meet Sismot Motanyani many years later, and I was already a journalist by then. I reminded her of a piece she wrote in '85, which inspired me and many comrades on campus. And I never forget that even until this day. But JQ, in '90, when I started working at the Saturday Star, he was the resident columnist writing Just John on Saturdays. And John was my hero. Man, the brother was black and proud. And it was quite unusual. You could see that when you read the Sowetan, that Joe's perspective, Agri on the line, those kind of columnists, you could see that, they're writing from a black perspective, but it wasn't surprising because they were in a black publication. But to be at the Star in 47 Sour Street and meeting John Qwelane for the first time, and here's the brother, man. He's standing tall, you take one good look at him as a young reporter, and you just see a hero. Because the reason he was head and shoulder above many was that when we got into journalism, there were a lot of senior black journalists who seemed to be apolitical, to our surprise. And we were coming from the background of activism, and we believe that being in journalism, being in the media, was part of the continuation of our struggle for emancipation. And it surprised us immensely that there were some senior black journalists who did not seem to care about who they were. So in John Qwelane, I met a senior black journalist who was extremely good at what he was doing. Meritocracy was what defined him. He was a senior black editor in the August publications by merit and nothing else. And John Qwelane was not ashamed, was not scared, And I could see that he trusted his own intellect, and he inspired a whole lot of us, the young ones who were coming in, by giving us the reassurance, expressly or unexpressly, that listen, you've got to be who you are, don't change. Just be good at what you do. And for that, I will never forget Bro John. When I got to work directly under him in 1992 at the now defunct Sunday Star, I was so proud that I'm working for the first time under a black editor. And it was JQ who was assigning me, go and do this story, go to Rustenburg. You come from Rustenburg, go and do this story in Rustenburg. Do this interview, go to Soweto. I mean, just to work under John Qwelane as a CAP reporter, being groomed by him, learning from the very best that our people could produce. It has never left me. I admire JQ for the rest of the time. When I got to know JQ as a friend now later in life, I knew that he was a no-nonsense person. Sis Modest already alluded to that. In one of the tribute pieces that I wrote, I do allude to the fact that JQ was not easy to deal with. And look, I'm saying this, you know, quite minimally when I say he was not easy to deal with, because you can really walk away covered in mud if you wrap him up the wrong way. But JQ was a gentleman. JQ was an activist to the end. Success did not stop John Qwelane from fighting for the rights of the weak against the powerful. Watching John Qwelane over many years of his career, and he spent a lifetime in journalism, watching him, and in the end, watching how the industry treated John Qwelane, it pained me a great deal. It doesn't pain me anymore because I myself has learned a lot of harsh realities about the intricacies of what goes on in our journalism in South Africa, in the media. But to have seen John Qwelane, one of the very, very best, being treated like a pariah, in the end, being jobless, in such a widespread South African media landscape, that pained me. It pained me more because I shared tea with him. We sat down when I was working in Parktown. And when we were busy in 1997 with the TRC, we, under the Forum of Black Journalists, we mobilized the veterans coming from the side of Black journalism. We organized a lot of veteran Black journalists. Now, in 1997, at the TRC, we mobilized senior Black journalists, the veterans, to say they must come under the auspices of the Forum of Black Journalists, of which we had started and we were leading, to go and make a presentation to the TRC to let the whole world know about the apartheid within the South African media. How Black journalists throughout time were discriminated against because of the color of their skin. Examples of, for an example, a Black journalist at the Star who was going to cover a story in Alexander and was given a scooter so that he could also deliver newspapers along the way whilst going to go and cover the story. You know, anecdotes like those, we believe that they had to be documented and be part of our history, so that those who want to learn about the journalism in South Africa must know exactly where we come from to be where we are. So John Qwelane went and make a presentation, and the Sunday Independent recently, they republished his entire presentation to the TRC where he's talking about his own personal experiences. Around 2007, when we resuscitated the Forum of Black Journalists, we came under a lot of stick. We came under a lot of stick. We were told we were racists. We can't talk about being black and anti-white and those kind of things. But still, we're coming from the same understanding that in order for us to become effective journalists, we have to show the propensity of understanding our very backgrounds and nature, so that people could understand in whatever we wrote about, the perspective come from the Afrocentric background. John Qwelane was beside us throughout our second struggle in the FBJ around 2007 and 2008. Fighting tooth and nail against the South African Human Rights Commission when they had ruled that we must accept white journalists who, on their weight, say they agree with everything that the FBJ was doing. And you said that's not how we had perceived our setup to be like. And of course, in the end, Opa, you were there. The good thing, John Qwelane was vehement, saying, listen, guys, either we take this to the Constitutional Court, and I said, or we close shop, Mr. JQ. And indeed we did, we closed shop and said, because of the absence of black outrage, we assume that black journalists will continue to fight for their own struggles from the comfort of their zones or discomfort of where they are coming from. But John Qwelane was a true comrade. John Qwelane was fearless, even when he struggled, even when he had no money. And he wrote me an email in London saying to me, Avram, White has got me where it had the most, in the pocket. And he was penniless, he was in debt, he couldn't pay his own bills at home. Life was tough. And on his behalf, I remain eternally grateful to the ANC government that in 2010, they roped him in Derco and became an ambassador to Uganda. And I know he did a hell of a good job there. JQ, I will always love you, my brother. You taught me a lot. I can talk about you the whole day, the whole week, the whole month. You were one of a kind. But one thing that has stayed with me, as a black man, be good at what you do so that no one will say you are there because of the color of your skin. You are there because of transformation. Everybody must know that on meritocracy, you are one of the best at what you are doing. Thank you, Sis Maud. Thank you, Opa. Thank you, audience, for listening.
Thank Ebe for that.
And we continue with our look at the morning newspapers, and our guest this morning is editor of Tribute magazine, John Qwelane. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Dave.
You've been going through the last hour or so looking at the papers. What are the main stories this morning that you've picked up on, John?
Most of them lead with, let's say, the violence on the East Rand. So what I noticed says 24 killed. The rest of the papers say 17. That is in the past 24 hours. Then the other story is General Qwelane and his call to arms. It's making most of the front pages. The government and the ANC are reported to have wrapped him over the knuckles for that sort of war talk. Citizen has that as their lead story. Beeld leads with that.
I noticed one of the Afrikaans headlines here this morning was saying words to the effect that warning by Rolf Meyer to say that General Qwelane was misleading, I think was the translation, wasn't it?
Yes.
Misleading the Afrikaner people.
Yeah, that's what he says. And then Cyril Ramaphosa of the ANC says the general is playing what he calls dangerous games. with that kind of war talk. So I think that's a story that's going to dominate the news for at least the next 12 to 24 hours.
Thank you, Abi, for that commentary on John. Now, John was an activist through and through. He was also a journalist through and through, but he was also a creative writer. You know, when at the same time when he wrote that Just John column, he also wrote John's Jive, in which he prided himself, as Tony Deegan said, of the use of the English language, of expressing himself and taking fun, and he did the same when he edited Tribute magazine. He wrote under a pseudonym called Denzel Mugwabe, I can't remember, but he would go off tangent and just play with the language. So yeah, John was a versatile journalist, an activist at core, an activist up to the end. He was one man who could cut his nose to spite his face, to his own detriment, as Abi has attested. Now we go to John as a trade unionist. And the first person who's going to speak about John is Sandra Nachfa.
Yeah, I met John in 1983 because I was still a kotsoki, as they will say in Afrikaans, the new kid on the block. So I was put to the pots cooking the food for the conference. But I constantly hear John shouting and, you know, going on. But I physically met him at the East London conference in 1984. Sorry, the Cape Town one was in 83 and the East London one was in 84. Now, I'd also known John for 5 years before that, just reading his columns. And Just John was the one thing you just never wanted to miss. You were on leave, you come back, you look for all the old copies and read the Just John column and other columns too that he wrote. Yeah, Just John was like my favorite thing to read. So I always looked up to this name. Then physically getting to the conference in East London, I wanted to run for the hills and thought I was at the wrong place because John was an extremely aggressive person, especially when he believed that what he was fighting for wasn't properly perceived or appreciated. John was, you know, I don't know John from the UBJ days. I hope Comrade Qureshi will be covering that. And neither do I know him from the WASA days. So I'm mostly covering the years from 1985 at the Reconciliation Conference up until the end. So I met this man, you know, fighting. And as John was fighting on behalf, he was the main spokesperson on behalf of we were like already two factions, you know, the Western Cape and some East London and those smaller regions. But the bigger region was the Transvaal, the then Transvaal and Petersburg, etc., and some people from Durban. John was a no-nonsense guy in his writing and in his columns. But as a trade unionist, you saw an almost vindictive, aggressive person. But that wasn't because John was, you know, a bad person at all. But, you know, those things come out afterwards. I was dead scared of John. Sitting next to comrades Anis Salim, Muhsin Williams, and Rashid Syria, who were our strong people in the Western Cape. And, you know, John like crushed them, you know, and I was intimidated by John. Nevertheless, in 1985, we had the Reconciliation Congress at Ipiliheng in Johannesburg. And that weekend, I traveled up. Getting to Johannesburg, I had a brother who stayed in El Dorado Park, whose son had been stabbed to death that Friday morning. So I now, had just been given this news via someone who found me via someone else, etc. But now we are fighting in this Congress to try and reconcile. Now, as aggressively as John almost was the key player in dividing the organization, a year ago, he aggressively fought for the reconciliation. And I heard one of his comments in the caucuses, and we would break into groups, where he said, we are not bigger than the workers in this country that are suffering, because management was now taking advantage of refusing to speak to either side, and said they didn't have an agreement with us, they didn't have an agreement with the other side. So both of us were almost locked out of any form of negotiations, etc. And John never minced his words. Whether you were his Pan-Africanist comrade or whether you were the ANC people, which I always felt he wanted to strangle. And John was, a person with passion for what he believed in. He had a deep passion. He was and he was a very compassionate person. And when you only need to get to know John really well in later years, that you see the compassionate person behind this. I always saw him as hard as nails. But in later years, I could see this man was also, could be as soft as a marshmallow. And if you went out to the ICFTU on a, fundraising event, you had to come back with bloody good things, because John will shoot you down that you hadn't done your job well enough, and which these things have been, raised by previous people. John wanted you to only do your best at all times and never give in. John, at times you would feel that John Qwelane was arrogant, but at times you didn't want John anywhere but on your side, and those were in those negotiations, etc. But he was also a very calm person. I remember once going towards negotiations and John was walking next to me. He literally took my hand and reassured me that I would be okay. And I was just going to bring the representation for the blue-collared workers. And he said, don't be intimidated by them, man. I've got your back covered. You'll do this. And all the same, so he was that type of a person. And John would almost want to lift you up in letting you get to know him. But then there was also that naughty John, which I didn't know in 1984, who would get to know where the first shebeen is around the corner or across the road. And the two of us would sometimes in later years, laugh about those things. But I've got only good memories of an extremely committed, hardworking, yes, at times troubled, and that would be covered by others. But he was a committed Pan-Africanist and played a central role in, as I said, the division and the reconciliation of the organization back in the 80s. And the unification didn't bring more joy to anybody than John. And the first thing that we were told, now you go out and please, Pastor, forgive my language, fuck them up. Because we had to now go and fight, for almost, I think, 18 months pay, back pay and things like that, because they wouldn't meet with us for the 18 months that we were two factions. He served in various positions, and one part when he served as the treasurer, we hadn't presented our audit statements. And I remember the tireless time that he had put in, and always just trying to get the organization to be a sterling example of a trade union organization. We shouldn't just be a somaso, you know. And he will tell us, not as you've been in you know, in your little township, and this is an organization that has an international status, and bear that in mind. And so I was extremely intimidated by John. Years later, you know, he one day said to me, "Comrade, I love you a lot," but I mean, that was said to me by many comrades. And I just laughed, and I laughed and laughed and laughed. And he said, "So why do you find it funny?" And I said, "You love me?" I was so shit scared of you. He said, "Why?" And he burst out laughing. And John had a hearty laugh when he laughed, you know. He would laugh where he could almost fall to the ground laughing. "Comrades of me, I loved you so I would never harm you, you know." And I was scared shitless of you. And he thought it was very funny. So I saw the John who could be this extreme negotiator. And I saw the comrade who would cover my back at all times, who was very concerned for the workers. I mean, I think one of the meetings, it was him who gave Joshua Rabarokwe, who worked at Sowetan, who was chairing a meeting, an extreme hard time for allowing Rory Wilson, also late now, to walk almost over us. And he just gave it to Joshua for being he wasn't, in John's opinion, not firm enough as controlling the meeting. But in later years after that, I would speak to John after both of us were no longer part of the organization. But I think the thing that stood out the most for me was, I think in 2018, I reconnected to him. First with Comrade Joe, and then he gave me John's number, and I reconnected with him with this constitutional court thing. And the two of us exchanged, you know, SMSs to and fro and calls in between. And then I saw this person who was now not, whose health was deteriorating, and who was very ill, but such a gracious person, accepting his ill health with so much grace. And secondly, being so grateful to the son. He just consistently told me about the quality of the son. And you get to see a complete different person. And that's where I saw this big marshmallow, soft John, kind-hearted almost. I mean, the kind-hearted past I have experienced previously. But if you had to look at the John Qwelane as a trade unionist, you have to be bloody good to stand up to him. And don't you come here with a little thing that he'll just squash you. At one conference, I think we went into 10 executive meetings every time, suspending conference to try and get us closer to each other. And that was John. Very, 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 very tough. If he believed in something, he goes all the way. And as Abby had said, you know, John proved to us, don't behave as if they, you know, as they think we are black, we are fools, we are stupid, we are weak, we are this. Absolutely not. Always walk tall and fight a good fight, so that they must know you are no walkover. He was absolutely a great person. I think most people loved him. For me personally, John was, you know, I just couldn't think that there would someone who would be telling off racist people like Trunich, but having the balls to go to their farm and not even being scared. So those things, you were so like, wow, this man is a great writer, yet he's an absolute good negotiator. because John cut no bones with anybody. He wasn't going to wrap you in cotton wool before he punched you. Thank you, Comrade Maud.
Writing a column for the Star was never a condition that my professional integrity could be salvaged at will. It was never a condition. And if it means having to stop writing that column just because we took them head on a question of principle, then yes, I'll stop writing the column, and I'll do that immediately. And I also need to say that I didn't ask to write that column. I was approached by the Star to write it. I would like to continue writing it. This is not a personal fight. It's a question of principle, but if it's taken out of context, if I don't write that column again, you won't find me crying. But writing a column for the Star or for anybody else was never and will never be a condition of allowing our professional integrity to be salvaged.
What an accurate description of John. Being a complex person, it was very difficult sometimes to get to that sensitive part of him. And yet he was a compassionate person. He was a sensitive person. And even a Christian, some people don't believe. But he had that side of him. And he sometimes he let his guard down, especially when he spoke about his children, Pumla and Sobuk. So you're absolutely right. He was a marshmallow. Sometimes who covered up his sensitive part by being just extraordinarily tough.
We're going ahead with our program. Thanks, Sandra, for that memory. And clearly, John was a guy who would have lived his life without care, being a white-collar worker, but the extension of the movement, trade union movement, to accommodate blue-collar workers was an interesting side of him, of people who were rising, but also picking up others who were down. Jackie, if you are ready, we'll come to you. Please share with us your perspective, your experience, your reflection of JQ. There are a few people who know the political side of John and the activism. That would be.
Thanks, Opa and Mott. John we could say he was a complex character, but he was also very simple and warm towards people that he associated with. But when I first encountered John, it was from a distance. You know, he was involved in the strike. I think it was in 1981. That media strike that journalists were involved in, that also included all other workers at the media outlets. He had a very strong argument against Brazinga, Don Matera, who had just been unbanned and was also at the Star. And he made a very impressive argument to me, because he was arguing that Bradon was being a demagogue and was not looking at all the aspects that were important for the workers involved. I mean, the strike was going on, and they had to come to a point where negotiations and compromises and things like that had to be done at the Agas. And this whole demagoguery that he was against was not helping the situation. And that strikes by their nature were not infinite. I mean, you could never take a strike for 6 months or more. So they had to come to some do-nothing with management. And Bradon was against that. But John argued very articulately on the point, and he made me take notice. I was not involved in the strike myself. We ran a book publishing house, and some of my friends who were journalists attended those meetings, and I slipped in to listen in and understand what's going on there. I then had a confrontation with John at some stage with my other colleagues in the creative writing side. I coordinated a publication called Staff Right, and after that we had Scotterville Publishers, which was a Black-owned book publishing house, and dealt with a lot of creatives. But we had gone seeking write-ups or publicity on some of the books and the works that we're doing with Ingwapele Madingwana, with Matsimela and some other person, I don't remember right now, but the four of us went into an encounter with JQ at the start. And JQ was very abrasive and almost canceled that admiration I had for him. He actually attacked the young poets that we were busy building through workshops, looking at their writings and promoting them and so on. And he referred to all of us as Qwelane poets, you know. And we were not really happy with what he said, and we tried to start an argument. But John could, once he got the floor, he would talk, and he really made us feel as if we were nothing compared to European poets, you know, because he referred to those old classic poets that you read at school, you know, the poets that we read and people refer to, including Shakespeare. And we felt, no, man, that's not where we want to go. And in any case, we have a different idiom, and our writing, even though could be taken to be of low standard, it had potential to grow, and it had to start from somewhere. And they couldn't. I mean, we were products of Bantu education, and we felt that John and others, particularly JQ himself, was not very helpful. Now you see, with this mixed encounter, I thought John was not a person really to be worried about. He was more interested. He was a lousy intellectual or a journalist who really a rebel without a cause. But then it happened that as some of our activities and commitment in the struggle rose up, I mean, I was working in the underground structures of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. And the PAC was reorganizing itself soon after 1982 with the leadership, particularly the leadership of John Pokela. So one of the critical issues we had to do was to try and raise the name of the PAC in the struggle fraternity, and try and recruit as many people as possible. And this was one of my responsibilities. And among the things that were important was to try and influence the opinion of some of the journalists to have a relationship with the renewed PAC. So I was not keen on working with JQ in any way, even though we realized that he had a partial approach, and he was more warm towards the PAC. I mean, everybody else would have been hostile at the time, but he was taking himself as an Africanist. One of my colleagues in that underground movement, Mudini Maiba, he was a journalist and he worked for the Star. And he told me that, no, I must change my attitude. It's important to work with John. I realized that I had no choice, and I did that. And I spoke to John calmly, just trying to suss him out. And I suppose somebody must have told him too that this is the man to talk to. You know, from then onwards, we became close friends, comrades, and we shared very important information that in the underground at that time were things that we did not have to disclose to anyone. And under in these structures, John was reporting to me. So I was his boss, you know. So, but in other instances, he would take keen interest in me revealing the information that I was not really aiming to do, because it would put him in trouble. We had a network of underground operatives in the area where I didn't know then that John came from, in Mafikeng, you know, what was then in the Western Transvaal, the greater Western Transvaal, up to Mafikeng, Taung, and some of the parts closer to Johannesburg. The underground was a very, how do I call it? Whilst patriotic, was also an instance where you took greater risk. I was doing this whilst doing book publishing and interacting with everyone else. And in my spare time over the weekend, sometimes midweek and so on, I would go and directly work with people in the villages and so on to organize a pipeline. And each time I came with material, this would be largely the PAC propaganda material. John would be interested to find out, how did this come in? I mean, we were smuggling in this information. And I would tell him that, no, we have people, this was stationed in Dinokana or in Ramotswa for a period. He knew all those places, including the areas in Botswana. And he told me that, no, man, I grew up in those areas. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I said, nah, but John, now you're crossing the line. I mean, I'm not supposed to tell you all this. But he would humor me, you know, he would, I always took the attitude that I'm not going to start an argument with John because I would never win. But I knew a way to get to him, and we became best buddies, despite the fact that we were dealing with political activities that were not legal. And I also had to protect his status, because as a journalist, it would not be right for him to be seen to be sectarian, partial, and being involved in a single party and being seen to be a propagandist of that party. But in the broad Azanian tendency, he did very well, because I mean, we overlapped and we understood each other very well. And some of the points that we were raising that he did in his journalism. I remember one time, I think it was the Africa edition of the Star. He interviewed Winnie Mandela, and she explained her brand of African nationalism. And I was so chuffed with John that, you know, this is good. I mean, you don't have to be sectarian, but we have to get things that unite us. And the interview did rounds, and we were very happy with that, which made it easier for people to work with each other around those during those times. But then came the great fallout. You know, the stories he wrote in Euthanasia. I think he had gone there to write a story of an uprising in that area. And he fell victim and was almost necklaced, because the uprisings in the area at the time was UDF centered, and I think he wrote something that were not did not make the UDF very happy. So we discussed this after 2 or 3 months after he came back. I said, no, but JQ, you are exposing yourself, and this is not good. I mean, we would discuss those things. So it was not just an activism that had no directions. We would debate issues, discuss issues, and he would also criticize the PAC, even though he was working and doing work for the PAC. And this was because, I mean, to build a party, you must have self-criticism. And he departed from that, he moved his arguments from that level. And his criticism would be spot on. You'd be to the point in creating some of the things, because we did not at that time even have the quality of leadership that is up there. We were building a party, and he understood how these things were going on. I think that there was a time when I was arrested in my, let's call them escapades for now. And as I did that, I was arrested in Koster, in the, and nobody knew that I was arrested. And I later realized that John made inquiries and wrote stories about the disappearance of this book publishing editor who was off the face of the earth without accountability. He worked closely with my wife there. My wife, I just got married, to make inquiries. He made inquiries with the security police, using his position as a journalist. And that saved my life in particular, because I was arrested with guerrillas who were armed. And under those circumstances, anything can happen to you. But the fact that I was there, it made the world know, particularly our comrades outside the country. So John played a very significant role in that manner. And he continued to provide, I mean, this is a passionate John now. The more human part of John. He gave my family support. He gave them updates of what was happening and so on. And sometimes he wrote articles not using his name. And I forget what the name was, but he would write an article about me without using his name, because I mean the associations between us could not really be revealed. And I think that John's activism was very clear. You know, he worked, when he lived in Shawela, he worked with Dr. Abubakar Asfat, you know, the doctor who had rooms in the township in some depressed area. And I think he worked with Masisul, with Albertina Sisulu in that doctor's room. I would find John with him all the time, and we would discuss activities of what's happening there. Unfortunately, that doctor was killed, and I think the story continues. I'm not going there because I'm not part of it. But what I'm trying to indicate is that John's activism bound him to a real activity where people who were doing work in communities would come to his house in Shawela after hours to talk to him and brief him. I did the same thing too. I would go to John at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the evening, sometimes 10 o'clock. And I knew that he had to be very early in the morning at the offices at the Star, but he would make himself available. I mean, he was a funny character, and he had no limits to his sense of humor. But I always found that each time I knocked at the door at this place in Shawela, he would open the door for me after hearing that it's me. But and he would be in his boxers, you know. And I say, "But John, you have to do something." And I said, "No, so what, man? We are here for something that's very clear." He used some of the his own family fortunes. You know, he used some of his money to support the activities we were doing. So John was not necessarily just a person who was a journalist without interacting with community activists. He himself was an activist. His concern with what was happening was more passionate and more included. I think that the rise and rise of his status as a journalist were such that we had to release him from these activities in the PAC, because it was not right for us to have a person of that stature with us in the PAC at that level. So we asked John to go gahle and not not get himself involved, so that he's able to reflect in his career as a journalist fairly on the activities of almost everyone, so that he's not non-sectarian, and he he understood that. But he came back again. I mean, towards the elections in April of 1994, we had difficulties. I was now in the leadership of the PAC. We had some internal difficulties that we were dealing with at the time, and he was privy to them. So he made himself available to pen the draft of the PAC's election manifesto. I would have loved to go into the recent past in my activities with Ben, but maybe a one-liner would be good, Opa. John began to talk to me in Setswana with our SNS communications. And I have that. I mean, the man was so articulate in that language. He expressed idioms that are more difficult, but undiluted, very clear. So I think his skills with writing, with language, was inborn. It's not just with English and so on, even with Setswana. That's the point I wanted to make. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to me on this.
Thank you. We'll now go to Ambassador Qwelane Mokoena to share with us his perspective when they decided to get on board the watchdog who was now going to back from their own ranks, and how he turned his orientation into being an ambassador from being a journalist, and how well he meshed himself into the job of being the ambassador. Ambassador Mokoena, are you with us?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, program directors. It's wonderful to be with this group of veteran journalists like yourselves, and Nbontate Jotholwe. I'd like to pass my greetings to you all, to the Qwelane family as well. Bontate Muruti, fellow diplomats and friends who are following the memorial service from South Africa and abroad, ladies and gentlemen. It was very interesting really to hear many facets of the life of John Qwelane. Certainly, as diplomats, we are taught to behave and speak in a particular way. We are taught to be respectful to the host country that is receiving us, and of course also the country that sends us abroad. So we talk in a particular way, and it's been a wonderful revelation to understand the different aspects and the complex nature of Ambassador Qwelane. I stand here really as Chief Director responsible for East Africa on behalf of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in memory of High Commissioner Qwelane. The Chief Directorate itself is responsible for Uganda, among other countries of the East African community. I personally actually had a very short encounter with Ambassador Qwelane because I left shortly thereafter for Angola. I only spent about a year with him reporting to me. But also I encountered him on occasions when we had heads of mission conferences, which were called by the department, and these were usually addressed by the president and of course the minister and various other ministers on various matters of foreign policy and issues of international and national interest. So I didn't really spend that much time with him because I mean, on a desk for a year is not sufficient to actually get to know a person as good. However, I remember him, of course, walking very slowly whenever we had those heads of mission conferences into the conference areas, but very confidently too. And he was also very quiet, I must say. I'm amazed that I'm listening to the various speakers, and I'm amazed that he was such an outgoing person, but he was very quiet. Maybe it was the diplomatic environment that kind of subdued him in our conferences, except for the time when I remember him going toe to toe with our former minister on a matter of international concern, but I cannot recall what the matter really was about. But on those occasions when he was quiet, of course, knowing him from his days in journalism and his journalism background, he was probably absorbing and analyzing every word from his interactions with principals. I can imagine that he must have felt very constrained by the world of diplomacy, because it's a very careful environment where you always have to count your words and try not to offend, especially the principals and the country in which you are posted, as you are regarded as a guest of your host country, and of course, as a servant of your own country who speaks on behalf of your country and your president. He, however, with time, Ntate Qwelane found his feet in this intricate world as time progressed. The late High Commissioner Qwelane was posted to serve, of course, as South Africa's chief diplomat in Uganda, as has been alluded, from March 2010 to June 2014. I would want to believe that he was really posted to Uganda as a result of his impeccable record that we have had from the speakers before me as a journalist who actively fought against apartheid with the mighty strokes of his pen. Few colleagues also reminded me of his days in 702, because, you know, before I came to speak, I had to call a few colleagues because I hadn't had as many encounters with High Commissioner Qwelane as some of our colleagues might have. But then one of them reminded me of his days in 702, where he would go toe to toe with a fellow from the Free State. And I think somebody mentioned the name, I couldn't get it clearly, but this was also remembered by some of our diplomats from that show, Midnight Show of 702, where he would go toe to toe with this, they said Vermaak or something. I understand they usually had very contrasting views, but true to his form, he would differ very gently, respectfully, and in a civilized and mature manner. High Commissioner Qwelane, as he was affectionately known as Bra John, was a Pan-Africanist, a staunch one, and was a freedom fighter of note. And he consequently, of course, earned his stripes to represent the government of South Africa outside of our national borders. It was befitting, therefore, for the family, Ntate Qwelane, when he passed on in December 2020, that they should inform the department for which he worked diligently and represented our country for 4 years. During his time, High Commissioner Qwelane had a number of accomplishments, and those that are in this world will understand what we mean by ensuring that an ambassador or a High Commissioner facilitates or ensures cordial or good relations between two countries. In this instance, he championed the inauguration of our joint bilateral commission with Uganda in 2012, November 2012. Now, we signed this agreement a number of years ago, but it was never inaugurated. So High Commissioner Qwelane came with full steam and ensured that there was an inaugural meeting. This inaugural meeting saw the signing of a number of agreements, and some of which were in the area of water, natural resources, some were in the area of defense and security. And he also, in his own accord, looked into areas of trade and investment, telecommunications, energy, infrastructure development, as well as cooperation on regional and continental integration issues. He actively also explored and initiated cooperation in sectors such as tourism, human settlements, health and higher education, and people-to-people interactions. High Commissioner was, however, very respectful, to us as professionals, even though some of us were quite were much younger than him. We recall fondly program directors that he used to address the males colleagues as sir and us ladies as ma'am. Coming from High Commissioner Qwelane, we felt very, very respected. We were his bosses, young as we were, but he really gave us and accorded us the respect befitting the positions that we held at head office. High Commissioner could be very paranoid at times. I don't know if others would share in this sentiment, but he believed that the SSA staff in his mission were bugging his phone and spying on him. And whether this was imagined or real, this is not something unique to him, because most of us, when we are out there, we always believe in this world of ours that the SSA is after us. It's not always the case, but they can speak for themselves. However, it's good because it keeps us on our toes, and you know, you always have to remember to do the right thing in case you are being followed. High Commissioner could say the most awkward things at the most unexpected times. And I want to share this and really hopefully not to offend anybody. But in one particular meeting, staff meeting that he held with his staff in Uganda, the one staff member asked for permission to travel to go visit her husband who was posted in another country. And, you know, in full view of every staff member in that meeting, High Commissioner asked the lady, "Oh, so you want to go see your husband? Something like, okay, roughly translated, you want to go visit your husband and you're gonna come back pregnant." Needless to say, the lady did not find this amusing. And of course, we ended up having to deal with a complaint at head office, which I'm not quite sure where it ended up, but I do slap on the wrist or something because I left before his time was over there. So who familiar Qwelane, Mama Libana, we thank you as the Department of International Relations for having loaned the department your husband, your brother, your father, your son, your uncle, your grandfather and cousin. It is not easy to leave your family to serve your country outside or abroad. While it might appear glamorous to some people, from the outside, you always regret those family unions, the functions, the funerals, and important milestones and events you miss, and you hope that your family will understand. We extend, of course, our sincere appreciation to the family, as well as his friends, for his service to the Republic of South Africa. He has already united with many other diplomats who departed before him, Bontate John Kadimeng, Bo Ted Pekani, Bo Lenin Shope, Bontate Seyate, Bo Ntete Curtis Nkondo, Bo Claudine Ramosepele, and Bo Zinzi Mandela, and many others. May the Almighty console the family and friends, and may you continue to cherish the wonderful memories Ntate John Qwelane has left behind. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mkwenya, for that witness to the national duty that JQ played. You are a witness too that you are putting a watchdog on a leash, and he did his best in the circumstances. I'm going to ask now that we move to the area with regard to Alcoholics Anonymous. We know that the pressures that goes with journalism and the amount of coping and at times taking what you call a dependency on other areas to cope. And I think this is what comes into this part of the program.
In Alcoholics Anonymous, we try to help each other. You know, to stay sober is not an easy thing. So we try to help each other. And John was passionate about people coming in, you know, the newcomers in the fellowship. He was passionate. I think he wanted people coming in who were ravaged by this disease of alcoholism to stay in Alcoholics Anonymous. I could see that he was enjoying his sobriety because he was a jovial person, a jolly person. You know, he shared jokes, we laughed. And as I say, you know, the arrogancy part, you know, people who are stubborn, who found it difficult to stay stopped. John will call them abontlogo gaivut. And we will be excited to listen to such terms, you know, in Tlogo gaivut. But then we got used to John, you know, my family and I, you know, we became close. And becoming close in a sense that, you know, even in between meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, we will keep in touch, keep in contact, you know, like sponsoring each other, you know, sponsorship. And Shem, the young Sobukwe, we used to call him Gaddafi. The young Sobukwe was still young, and we had a wonderful time with him. We had a wonderful time with him. At some stage, John had to be out of the country. I think he was in Namibia. And at that time, he was like a loner. You know, in Alcoholics Anonymous, we like to say working with others helps. So when John was outside the country, my family and John, that's how our relationship got strong. And it helped me to stay stopped. It helped him to stay stopped. And when John came back, I remember at some time, you know, John's health was not that good. You know, he spent more time in hospital than at home. Fortunately, the hospital that he used was not far from my place. So I will go to the hospital with my wife and, you know, we spent time with John.
Yeah.
He didn't tell us that he was under strict, you know, diet from the doctor. So he will ask us to bring these fizzy drinks, you know, and we will take it in. Then Sobukwe found out that we were giving his father this, and Sobukwe was not happy. And he, you know, we stopped doing that. But you know, we kept going to hospital to John, and the nursing sisters or the nurses, the staff at the hospital, they respected John.
Another story that has made it is Comrades runner Herman Mattia, finally officially disqualified by the Comrades Committee.
Of course, he was alleged to have joined the race about halfway through. That he hadn't
that's
run
right.
The whole race.
That's right. And I see the committee didn't even take into account the damning evidence of the taxi driver who claims to have taken Mattia there. All that they relied on was SABC TV footage of the entire race and footage by a freelance cameraman who also filmed the entire race. And apparently Mr. Mattia doesn't appear anywhere until after
It's
the
an
halfway
interesting
stage.
point that they can be that certain based on video footage it implies that they have got video coverage of every stage of the race.
Yes, certainly they have.
Yeah, and if you don't figure in there, well, then you weren't there. So
Yeah,
you couldn't
they have
been there.
They have, and I seem to recall Mr. Mattia immediately after Comrades, when his seventh position was queried, saying that he did see himself on TV in the first half of the race. Now, this doesn't seem to have been the case when the appeal committee convened.
It's a very interesting point. And there were, of course, also allegations that it wasn't the first time.
Yeah,
that he had cheated?
In the Western Cape, his own club, 2 weeks after the saga broke into the open, his own club also queried some times that he had clocked for them, seen against the 7 hours he clocked for comrades.
MCs, I need to give this celebration DQ's last words. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. He wrote saying an African proverb has this piece of wisdom. It takes a village to raise a child. It couldn't be truer in my particular case, considering the bohemian environment to which I grew up at the Start village in Mahikeng. I had dozens of aunts and uncles, cousins, and other older people, all living in a relatively free atmosphere, marred only by the periodic savagery of the pestilential and oppressive white rulers. Head of my mentors was my maternal grandmother, Mrs. Usinyeng Rebecca Serache. Bless her gentle and loving soul. I literally harassed her for knowledge, asking her almost everything under the sun. And she patiently answered my questions to satisfy an inquisitive young mind. First behind Granny comes Oma Fink, paradoxically a boerevrouw and a neighbor, whom I loved with everything and for whom I would have done anything. I offer my sincere thanks to all members of my extended family at the start, both departed and those still living, who nurtured me into the person I became. I also thank my school teachers and the various editors for whom I worked, and my many newsroom colleagues, especially my all-time favorite journalists, Banim Tomboti and Felicia Oppelt. Most heartfelt gratitude to the late A.B. Mare, who was a superb Sunday Star Stone sub and review sub rolled into one. The man was an exceptional journalist born for his craft. I extend particular deep gratitude to my family. Their names will remain forever etched in gold in my mind and in my heart, because they stood by me throughout my frequent bouts of serious illness. Some of them spent long and often emotional hours on the telephone or at my bedside in hospital. I'm grateful to the matriarch of our clan, Dr. Qwelane, my great uncle, the Reverend Father Israel and Mrs. Ida Qwelane, my sisters, Mrs. Tandi Ngengebule and her husband Brakeni, Sis Pompi, Sis Nomonde Ndimande, Sis Makukuzo, Nkosi, Sis Christina, Peggy, Beauty, younger brother Tau Ronald, and my daughter Kilebogile Lolo Seleka and her husband Mwekezi Moremi. I extend my loving and especially heartfelt gratitude to my own son Sobukwe, the boss. On many nights when I was in great distress, he woke up and without a murmur of complaint or dissent, carried me by himself into the car and faced the dangers of a dark Johannesburg night as he drove alone to the hospital in Brixton. He visited me daily at the hospital, sometimes twice a day. Ndiyabulela boss, nangomso, bejula. My sincere gratitude to my last remaining uncle on my mother's side, Uncle Thomas Kimuizi Serache, and his children and their children. My deepest gratitude to the Tsiba family of Sosangove in Pretoria. Their son Tsepo married my beautiful niece Babalelo a couple of years ago, and it was for me a great honor to give her away. Every member of the Tsiba family, from matriarch to great uncles, aunts, and brothers, has extended great warmth and love to us since the families came together. I feel that the Tsibas have given the traditional concept of Botho its true and rightful meaning. My great thanks go to Amandungwane in Gauteng. And here I will convey my deepest gratitude and respect to our local headman of the Amandungwane, Solomze Selane, and to my brother Buti Bacela Balo Qwelane, who traveled from the Eastern Cape to visit me. I extend my deepest thanks and regards to the community leader, sociologist, educationalist, and businesswoman, Shirley Mabusela. My sincere gratitude and humility to my good friends, the loving and adorable couple, Nong and Tunyelwa Tolwe, and to the highly articulate and incomparable Mr. Deliza Kumalo. They've been with me through thick and thin, bitter and sweet. Sincere thanks to all my genuine friends at Ntokozweni in Moletsane, Soweto. They know who they are. Thanks to Sandal, Suban, Big Vince, Paul, David, Manda, Sizwe, and all the excellent folks in Tembisa, Binoni, Katehong, and Vosloorus. They have all faithfully stood by me in the face of daunting odds. I'm deeply indebted to my very great friends, Rina Minevini and Kanya Rajwili. Thanks to Professor David Block of Wits University for his great interest in my deep love for everything in the heavens and for nursing that love. On occasion, the superbly intelligent man of letters and figures, besides featuring on my radio talk show as an eloquent and informed guest, also invited me to introduce him to audiences at the Linda Auditorium when he gave his popular lectures on the likely fate of the universe. My deepest thanks to medical practitioners, among them Dr. Soraya Osman, Michael Malaka, Dr. Amin Sidat, and Dr. T.P. Ndambi for battling against tall odds to keep me breathing and alive. Thanks to the pharmacists Joyce Mwamuhwe and Bongani Mlambo for dispensing all the prescribed medication, and sincere gratitude to all the incredible dedicated nurses at a number of hospitals that looked after me. Finally, and with no pun intended, I am heavily indebted to my lawyers, Jürgens Becker and Andre Burna. I thank you all very much. Signed, John Qwelane. Thank you, Madam.
The Madiba wedding was easily the most special moment of my life. I mean, here was a president, the whole president of South Africa, just decided to take a walk from his house along Central Street in Houghton to my office, just to come and give me an invitation. And he found me not there, went upstairs to my office, took a notebook. There was a notebook on my desk. Wrote a letter there. Wrote a letter to say that he had come to see me, but he didn't find me, but he would come again. That he told me once that it was again on a lunch date. He had invited me to his Houghton place for lunch. And then he told me that he was under pressure from some elders in the ANC and from particularly people such as Archbishop Tutu, Bishop Dandala, were telling him that he should formalize his union with Mrs. Machel, and he was going to do that, but it was to be a secret. Please don't write about it, don't whisper about it, don't tell anybody, he said. And of course I kept the secret. Some months later he came again to remind me. This time he found me in the office to remind me that don't tell anybody, but it will be on July the 18th. And then he said I would be the only journalist he would have at his wedding. So I said to him, I agree, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bracho, for that touching thank you. I hope all being possible, we'll be able to share this word of gratitude from JQ with the nation in one form or the other possible at our disposal. Thank you for conveying the message in the manner JQ would have trusted you to do. Thank you. We're now going to ask a family member to do a vote of thanks if there are no connection problems. If there are connection problems, we'll ask Reverend Joe Mdlela to give us the closing benediction.
Good evening. I would like to thank each and everyone who took part tonight. As I have said earlier on, that And the stories made me realize that there was more to my father than being a journalist who worked for various media houses. And I thank you for the knowledge. Indeed, this was knowledge building for me. And I think to many youngsters who didn't know half of what we were told. Once again, I would like to thank each and everyone. And I would like to thank Ubabus Tembele for the amazing support that you gave my father. I would like to thank you. I know you had a brotherhood relationship with my father. Once again, I thank the whole team for giving us an amazing memorial. I say thank you, everyone, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Brajo, if we can have Reverend Mdlela, you could please do us the closing remarks.
MCs, Maud and Oba, thank you for conducting this celebration. This was indeed a celebration. We know all sides of JQ tonight. It was a complete picture of the man, including pictures and sound that said, this was JQ. Thank you so much to everybody who participated in planning for this celebration and all those who came to participate in the celebration. It was a life worth celebrating. It was a life well lived. He's gone to our forefathers, because he has done his bit this side of the world. Thanks to each and every one of you. And thanks to Stembela Kala, again, for being the driving force behind putting this celebration together, and all the members of the committee that participated. MCs, thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brajo, and good night.